Now I have the great pleasure of introducing today's special conversation, Reconciliation and Philanthropy, featuring Victoria Grant, Maang Indoden, Loon clan, Teme-Augama Anishnabai Qway, woman of the Deepwater people, and a member of the Temagami First Nation, as well as Julie Davis, Vice President, External Relations and Advancement at Trent University. Victoria has served as a director on a number of boards within the philanthropic sector over the past 30 years. She is especially proud of the Temagami Community Foundation, where she was co-founder and inaugural chair, as well as her work with Community Foundations of Canada, where she has been a past chair of the board. Victoria is closely connected with the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, a program that began as a response to COVID-19 in March of 2020 and is led by Indigenous peoples to support organizations that are led by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples and communities. Julie Davis has been in her VP role at Trent University since 2011, reappointed for a third term in October of 2021. In addition to being responsible for philanthropy, alumni affairs, and external relations, Julie's portfolio was expanded to include responsibility and oversight of the Trent lands. Julie is also set to become my successor as CCAE board chair in about 45 minutes, or even sooner if I can talk quickly. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Derek, and Anine, Victoria. We are very grateful for your time today, and I look forward to talking with you about reconciliation and philanthropy. And so I'd like to start with your work with the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. And the Circle was formed to guide a new way of working between philanthropy and Indigenous beneficiaries and communities in the context of reconciliation and the decolonization of wealth. So could you start by talking about what philanthropy means to Indigenous peoples and communities?
Well, first of all, understanding philanthropy in communities is different than understanding philanthropy as we know it. And I would, or as we come to know it in the non-native world, I think our whole, if you look at the way I look at philanthropy and how I came into it, is philanthropy is about love of humankind. That's technically, and it comes from the Latin word. And I think if you look at Indigenous worldview and values, it is really about love of not only humankind, love of life, land, birds, everything, and anything that breathes, and anything, and the natural world that provides the sustenance. So I think if you think about those two things, it is a bit different in the sense of how we look at philanthropy. And one of the things when we started the Circle on Philanthropy, and the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada has grown. It has changed. It's different than it was at the beginning, and that's that's the way organizations grow. But in 2008, the same year as the apology from Stephen Harper, there were a number of us who were working in philanthropic organizations in Canada, realized that there was less than 0.1% of philanthropic dollars going into Indigenous communities. And of that money, 80% of it was or around 80% at the time, this was a study that we kind of did at the time, was managed by non-Indigenous organizations for Indigenous peoples. So, so philanthropy as we know it really didn't exist in Indigenous communities, and if we were thinking about it in terms of how we in the Western world think about philanthropy. And I would say that in today's world, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, which was started at the beginning of COVID, started as a result of wanting to knowing that the gaps in Indigenous communities this wasn't going to be new. This was just going to be made worse by COVID. And so in March of 2020, 4 organizations came together and put $1.5 million up or gathered it together, and we're looking for a way to put it into community. And that's when the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund was born. And I would tell you that the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund could not have happened but for 2008, which was what we call the grant making network for Indigenous peoples in Canada, and which turned into the Aboriginal peoples, the Circle on Aboriginal Peoples and Philanthropy, which led to the 2015 Declaration of Action by philanthropic communities, which we were at 5 years, and when in 2020, after, it was 5 years after. And I really believe in many ways the IPR, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, was born out of that declaration. And that would not have happened. All these things needed to happen for it to happen. And I would say the way we're doing philanthropy in the Indigenous Peoples, with the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, is we're talking about, in our communities, we recognize oh my God, I'm gonna lose the words. We recognize the integrity, the creativity that's there. So we're not building capacity, we're supporting capacity, because the capacity's there. We're walking with them to provide help, to provide the support they need to do the things they need to do. And that's the philosophy of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund.
Thank you. No, and I have the Declaration of Action as my mouse pad as a good reminder for me. And thank you. I want to pick up on one of the comments you made about being coming into a world where funds for Indigenous people were being managed by non-Indigenous people. And certainly one of the many learnings I'm centered on when working with Indigenous peoples is that concept that's often expressed as nothing about me without me. And often talked about as co-creation. And so when looking at our members' work, universities, colleges, and independent schools in raising funds for Indigenous student financial aid or traditional spaces on campus or other projects designed to advance reconciliation, what does this look like? How do we engage in this co-creation?
As I was reading, you'd said some of this ahead, and I was reading the nothing about me without me. I don't think that, I think the primary thing there is relationship. In that statement is relationship. And when you think about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous worldview, it is about relationship. It's all about relationship. So in that context, I think I think that what we need to think about in all of these things is, what is the relationship? How do we develop the relationship? Who needs to be at the table in that relationship? And for me, that is the biggest thing is relationship, is how do you create that? And when I think about financial aid for students, I'm not raising money for students is a good thing. It is, what is the criteria? How is the criteria developed? And this is in the relationship. What is it used for, and how is it used? I sometimes think, what we do in all of us in philanthropies, sometimes we'll think, okay, we're going to raise money for this, and this is the criteria we're going to be using. And sometimes that criteria, and so then we get into this terminology of indigenous peoples. And so in the universities, I hear conversation around indigenizing, and the problem you have is Indigenous peoples, we are so different culturally from across the board. So you need to ask yourself, when somebody's applying from the East Coast or somebody's applying from the North, what do they identify as the criteria that they need to come into your world? So how do they see themselves in that criteria, and how can they apply it? Those is, we're very conscious of that in the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, because we're putting money, some of our support is going up to the north, some of it's going to the west, some of it's going to the south, and some of it's going to the east. So in that, what we're doing is we have regional review committees, and they know their communities. So they make those decisions, not, the IPRS criteria is pretty open, and it's tied to responding to the need of the community. And when I think of traditional spaces, what is a traditional space? What is a traditional space? So I'm chair of the Canadian Canoe Museum. And one of the things, when we started to talk about Indigenous, my idea is that we got to focus on the Anishinaabe in that world. And that's got to be center and be the center of what is Indigenous in the museum, because that's where we live. That's what we know. And we can apply that as we bring in canoes from other parts. That's a whole different, and we can use their language and the description. So it's the word Indigenous sometimes can be make it too small, make it, put it in a box and put all the criteria on the box. And that's one of the things that terrifies me about using that term indigenize or indigenizing or those terminologies. I guess what I would say is, and then, advancing reconciliation, when you think about advancing reconciliation is going to take a long time. And you picked up that little round thing, which I think that can apply to any, the steps, the 7 steps in that thing can apply to anybody you're working with, in any community you're working with, because it's about listening and learning. It's about participating. It's about acting, and you have to do all of that has to happen together. But the other thing is understanding or trying to create an understanding of where the community you're at, that you're working with in this process of reconciliation. A number of people have said to me over the last few years is, I'm not sure I should be leading reconciliation as an Indigenous person. And my answer to that is, why shouldn't we? Because the Indian Act that they did at the beginning didn't do us much good. So I think, I believe I have a role to play in reconciliation, but it's also, I also understand that process. I also understand those who say, I don't want to do this work anymore because it's tiring. It's tiring, it's overwhelming, and everybody's asking for help. They want help. Yesterday I had a conversation with my chief about the land acknowledgement, and her answer was, well, I want them to do it. And I said, but if they don't understand how to do it, why do we want them? Why not teach them how to do it? And it was, it's that kind of stuff. So it is something we're working in, we're living in. I don't think it's going to happen in my generation, but I think we can make it better.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many things I want to unpack there. I start with relationships. I mean, this is the business that all of our members are in. And, if we look at any of the relationships that we develop in advancement with alumni, we don't homogenize our alumni population, and we treat each individual and we look at their background, and we develop that relationship slowly. But I do think you're right. We have at times approached Indigenous communities too much as a national perspective. I can reflect on some of the work I've done in the last few years with our local Mechisagi community. And we sat down with the elders with our agenda and said, here's our work plan. And they said, well, we'll see if we get to that. Let's start to talk first and see if we can come to some common agreements and understandings. But first, you need to learn about the treaties. Come back when you understand that. And so we spent quite a bit of time building a protocol guidebook so that we could come to the table informed and respectfully engage and understand how to participate in the appropriate traditions. And we're still learning, but we've developed a level of respect that when we get something wrong, we're gently guided and taught how it should be. And so, but it takes time and it takes a different approach. And we do that in advancement. We understand how that works. And so thank you for pointing out that we need to mirror that in all of our work with Indigenous people as well. Certainly, one of the very important ways to advance reconciliation is to ensure that there are Indigenous people in a variety of roles, especially at the leadership level. And I congratulate you for being one of those leaders as chair of the Community Foundations of Canada, chair of the Canoe Museum here in Peterborough. So what advice can you give us as advancement professionals and CCAE on how we might increase the number of Indigenous peoples in the advancement and philanthropic sector? I look around and I don't see very many people. Are there barriers that exist to engaging students in this work and moving into this profession?
It's interesting, and that's a great question. And when I think about what brought me here, it is about, I've always been a community builder as a kid. From the time I was one of those kids who liked clubs. I don't know why. I don't even know where the term club came. I mean, I was a lone Girl Guide. I did my Girl Guide stuff by correspondence because the Girl Guides offered correspondence Girl Guides. But I sometimes, so as I got older and I started to be in the, I was spending, when I moved into a non-native community, I wanted to get involved. And sometimes, I don't know if I don't think it's as bad as it was, I would hope not, but the question, when you're in a room as an Indigenous person, I don't know why, but if the question around Indigenous peoples come up in any way, shape, or form, every head in the room looks at you. So it is, how do you change that scene? How do you change all of that? And how do you expose people to those kinds of things that would allow them to be interested in it? It's such a, it's such a big, it's a big step in coming out of your community, first of all, because most people come out of community at high school level. From the First Nations perspective, they come out at high school level. And most of them aren't living with their own families. So all of that is such a huge change. I think more and more families are moving with their kids and doing that, which is I think a much better way of doing it. But I think in time it'll change, but I don't think it's going to happen fast. I think you got to encourage, and when you see an opportunity, you got to take that opportunity and invite them in. And you got to invite them in a way that speaks to the interest that they're doing, what they're doing, not to the interest of what the organization is, but how they can provide support to that organization. When I joined the Community Foundations of Canada, I joined first through the Trillium Foundation. I saw all these organizations being formed, and I thought, why can't we do that in my community? And that's how the Temagami Community Foundation was formed. I did it I kind of turned it up on its head. I didn't bring all the people who were going to, normally a foundation comes out of people with money formed the organization. So the Community Foundation in Temagami was formed by the community and invited the people with the money to come join us, not as a board member, but as a community member. That hadn't happened in Canada at the time. We were one of the only foundations in Canada that had in their bylaw that the local Indigenous community had to be a part of it. So I think it's a building of all these little things that will lead to that change and bring people in those roles. Because you're not going to go from being here and into a leadership role without you need role models. You need people who you can follow, who make it accessible to you. And I think the biggest thing is accessibility.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you. You are certainly a role model in the sector for all professionals, not just Indigenous. And I think as you've spoken to, the journey that we're working on must go from being Indigenous benefiting to Indigenous informed, and ultimately to that work that is grounded in that reciprocal partnership and is Indigenous led. And so what might that look like for our profession as advancement professionals working with donors, alumni, and Indigenous communities? How might we as a membership organization support our members to engage respectfully and appropriately in this work together?
So I'm going to tell you what we're doing at the IPRF, because this is really interesting. So we have a board that's all Indigenous, but we have partners. We call them partners. We don't call them funders. We call them our partners. And we invite them to walk with us. And what we say is, we want you to come with us, but every 4 months we host a meeting of our partners, and we invite some of our board members will be there, and some of the recipients of our support will be there. And we actually talk about engagement. What is engaged? Because what we're saying to our partners is, we don't want you to give all of your funds to us so that we can put it in Indigenous communities. What we want to do is, we want you to walk with us, learn how, and develop a direct relationship with those communities. That's a tough thing to do, but you have to have incredibly open communication and discussion. And it is interesting to see how, and what we do on these calls is we'll have breakout rooms, and people who we try and set up the breakout rooms to those we know who have some experience working in Indigenous communities, and with those new funders who haven't. And we create those discussions and lines of communication. Most times there will be 1 or 2 Indigenous people in the room who will, sometimes they're just listening, sometimes they're participating, but it's just trying to break down those barriers of because sometimes the barrier is just the idea that these people have money. These organizations have lots of money, and we don't. That's a barrier in and of itself. And so those kinds of things we find is the open discussion and the communication is really important between all of us, and also being able to ask the hard questions, holding people accountable, and really, that little mat you use, we hold, and that's the thing we hold up in front of our partners all the time, is we continue to say, this is what we're committed to doing.
Well, it's been a wonderful opportunity to chat with you, Victoria. I have so many more things we could talk about, but I think understanding this as a journey, reconciliation, is a journey. I don't know that there's an end to it. It's one that we walk together. Sometimes we're a few steps behind. I talk about looking back and being happy about the milestones we've achieved, but knowing that there's many steps ahead, and it's a wonderful learning journey. And that's certainly been my experience. And I've certainly been greatly enriched by the opportunity to walk this path with people like you who are willing to share their time and advice. But it's really important that, I think, as you also noted, that we need to pick up the mantle as well. There's a lot of demands on Indigenous leaders, Indigenous communities, and also Indigenous students. And I've been in rooms where the emotional labor of them sharing their story is quite challenging. And it's incumbent upon us to take our learning ourselves as far as we can, and then be respectful of the time of the elders and the youth. And the community leaders, so that we can share amongst ourselves what we're learning. And I'm certainly looking forward to my term as chair, making that a priority as well. So I congratulate you on the work you've accomplished for Canada, for the communities, and thank you very much, Teme-Augama, for the time that you've spent with us today. We are extremely grateful for your insights and advice.
I only have one other thing I would say to you.
Please.
Time.
Mm-hmm.
Time in the Western world is very different than the time in the Indigenous communities. And you know, it's funny, I'm married to a non-Indigenous man, and there, even within our relationship, I'll say, you know, he'll want me to commit to something, and I'll say, that's 6 months away. I'm not going to commit to it today. Put it in our calendar, and if it happens to work out, it'll work out. But that is one of the significant big differences in our world and your world is time. Yeah, and what is time?
Yeah, and absolutely, you started at the top to talk about the difference between the Western and Indigenous worldview, and having that understanding from the outset. And time, I have learned too, is a key part of that. It will take the time that it will take.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Victoria, so much, and Julie, for leading such an interesting conversation and helping us better understand the connection between reconciliation and philanthropy, and even offering a little bit of marital guidance at the end there. So that's great. So thank you both for taking the time. Really appreciate it.